Hello, everybody. Thanks for taking the time this afternoon to come to this REMI webinar on transportation and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am Katy Koon. I'm an analyst here at REMI, and I'm joined by Haozheyi Guan, another analyst here who helped prepare this presentation and demos. So you can introduce yourself, Haozheyi.
Hi, I'm Haozheyi. I'm an economic analyst here. Thank you, Katy.
Yeah, of course. It looks like we have a fair number of people here already, so we can go ahead and get started with this presentation. So just jumping into an overview of what we'll be covering today. First of all, we'll sort of tee up the presentation with some background to specifically outline what DEI means in a transportation context. We'll also talk a little bit about why DEI matters to NPOs, DOTs, and other transportation agencies and organizations specifically. And then we'll kind of begin talking about transportation accessibility and what that means in the context of DEI. From there, we'll go into why economic modeling. This section will sort of set us up for the value added of economic modeling in these transportation and DEI situations. And from there, we'll go into a model demo looking at a specific policy simulation to really see how a transportation project has important DEI impacts. And finally, we'll discuss the results of that demo, go over some of the major takeaways, and then open things up for a Q&A. So please feel free to submit those questions after the presentation, and keep in mind, as we go through this, any points of confusion or points of clarification you'd like to ask about, to be sure to save those for the end. So without further ado, I'd like to kind of start us off with some definitions for what diversity, equity, and inclusion means in a transportation context. So when we are asking about diversity with transportation projects, we're thinking about whether a region's transportation networks adequately connect diverse workers to job opportunities. When we talk about equity in a transportation context, we're thinking about whether all neighborhoods, communities, demographic groups, income groups, etc., do they have equitable access to affordable transportation, or is anybody being left behind? And when we talk about inclusion, we're thinking about what groups have been historically underserved by a region's transportation system. And the key question there is, how can we bring everybody in to benefit from transportation infrastructure and transportation systems? So with those questions in mind, I think that it's helpful to sort of tie this all back to your organization. So why does DEI matter to your organization? I'm sure there's many answers to this, but some sort of key overarching ones would be for metropolitan planning organizations. It's very important to increase mobility and opportunity for everybody in the region. Important to optimize the use of regional assets, and of course very important to strengthen partnerships across your region, across institutions, so that citizens are best served. Departments of transportation similarly are interested in driving broad-based economic growth and development and in increasing regional competitiveness. So sort of from this economic development perspective, DEI really matters when it comes to ensuring that everybody is being brought up, ensuring that the benefits of economic growth and development are broad-based, and ensuring that accessible transportation is readily available to those who need it. Additionally, there are increasingly federal, state, and local reporting requirements when it comes to DEI metrics. So having those numbers to point to and to keep track of are really critical, in ensuring that a project is having appropriate DEI impacts and is really taking those into account. And finally, to address stakeholder concerns, as it's increasingly important to everybody that we get DEI right. So a reason that transportation specifically is such an important topic when it comes to DEI issues, I think one way to illustrate this is in this graph from the ACS, where we can see the percentage of workers without a vehicle by race and Latino ethnicity. This is from 2011 to 2015, and we can see that the largest proportions of people that can't get to work with their own car are, majority African American, Latino, and Asian American, whereas white people tend to have a vehicle at home. So transportation accessibility clearly has some DEI implications when it comes to, who needs public transit and who needs that to get to work. Again, this is also a good illustration of how different racial and ethnic groups in the U.S. are, disproportionately reliant on transit. You see that overall the largest group are white / Caucasian people, but given the proportion of the U.S. population that they make up, they're underrepresented in transit, whereas Black, Hispanic, Asian American, Pacific Islander, etc., they are proportionally more likely to use transit, as we might expect from the previous graph showing us the percentage of communities with access to a vehicle at home or without access. So that sort of sets up the general perspective on why transportation and DEI matter and how they relate to each other. But another key element of that is this concept of spatial mismatch. So when we think about, for instance, in this visualization, we're looking at a specific city, but this is applicable across many cities in the US, where we see the largest concentration of households below poverty level, and we see the transportation system, sort of failing to connect them with the job opportunities that are growing the most. So this spatial mismatch really captures that. I would say that missing link between the people who need these jobs and where the jobs are located. So transportation, quality, accessible transportation is really needed to connect these communities with job opportunities. And then additionally, those who commute to work by public transit, this graph sort of reiterates what we saw in that ethnic and racial breakdown of users of public transit. But again, we know when we're thinking proportionally, thinking about the population of the United States and those who use public transit, we see that there are some key DEI impacts to look at there. So when we think about economic modeling in terms of transportation and DEI, we want to capture the direct and indirect effects of transportation and infrastructure investments, as well as other policies. So, using a practical economic modeling software solution, this is a way to really be able to see, not only the direct impacts of a project over a short time frame. With REMI, we can really take a look at those indirect effects, across different industries, across different demographic groups, and income levels, et cetera. So you get a much more holistic picture of what a policy or project is doing. We can also help policymakers understand economic and demographic impacts, again, across all different industries and over a much longer time horizon. So you can see out to 2060 what the impacts of a policy or project might be. We can help articulate the costs, benefits, and trade-offs of policies and projects, and bring those standardized metrics to policy evaluation before implementation to help clarify complicated policy situations. So who we are Regional Economic Models Incorporated, in case you are unfamiliar with us. We're also we also go by REMI, and we've been around for over 40 years working on providing practical solutions to these complicated policy challenges. When it comes to transportation, we have our particular model TranSight, which we'll be using later today with the DEI extension. So we'll be able to look at a transportation project and not just look at the impacts of that transportation project from a more general macroeconomic perspective, but also really dig into the dimensions of race and ethnicity, gender, education level, geography, income distribution, etc. Really add those DEI dimensions to our impact analysis. So that's who we are, and that's kind of how we will transition into our particular scenario that we'll be demoing. So our example today is the US 29 BRT corridor, which is located on the eastern side of Montgomery County, Maryland, near the borders with Howard and Prince George's County. So you see this illustration to the right. You can see a map of the current transportation layout. So in this corridor in Montgomery County, we can see where buses go, where mixed traffic operates. See the purple line, light rail, where it's planned, as well as some of the other DC Metro Rail stops intersecting with the Montgomery County corridor here. This is a useful example because US 29 really provides a snapshot of America's increasingly diverse suburban areas. So bringing in that geographic regional component, not just looking at urban and not just paying attention to urban areas benefiting, but also looking at how policy affects suburban areas and rural areas. But in particular, US 29 BRT, this corridor is comprised of 65% minority populations, 32% foreign-born populations. Also, from the income distribution perspective, there are 30% of households in the corridor that earn less than half of the area median income, and 12% of households have no vehicles available, meaning that they are very reliant on transit to get them to those opportunities. So the US 29 BRT will provide the most in-need populations with access to jobs in DC. Of course, this is a real-world situation, very, very relevant. And thinking about this in terms of a model simulation, we will be using data that is informed by some of the actual data Montgomery County has been using, but I do want to make it clear it's a hypothetical scenario that could be applicable to other similar corridors throughout the U.S. And so we've been informed by the data that's being used or that's been gathered in Montgomery County, but we've made some adjustments as well. But before we get to that, the TranSight DEI model that we'll be using for our demonstration is really useful for this type of analysis because it integrates economics with travel demand modeling. Essentially, we take into account emissions, safety evaluation factors, and fuel efficiency data into our TranSight model. And this helps us capture direct and indirect effects of transportation projects. Another important piece of TranSight is our travel demand module, which enables users to input data from their own travel demand models and input that into TranSight to see these additional impacts as outputs. This diagram kind of gives us a brief overview of how TranSight evaluates transportation policy, so that before we pull up that model, we all have an idea in our head of how this is working. So you can input your data, so project-specific data, and again, like with that with the transportation model here, you can add in, from an external model, it integrates with TranSight. You can adjust the input values to really capture the effect of that transportation project or policy, including construction, O&M, finance, regional effects, and as well as fuel demand, emissions, safety, and time savings. And all of this goes into TranSight, which then uses transportation cost matrices, REMI policy variables that are then run and give these economic results that we will see in a couple minutes. So TranSight really enables users to process these results to generate comprehensive forecasts of the project's macroeconomic effects. So you're really able to see beyond what the other transportation models can show you and integrate it into TranSight so that you can see these more widespread impacts. So to set up this model demonstration specifically, we will be modeling the build out of a new bus rapid transit station with enhanced BRT services in Montgomery County, specifically along that US 29 BRT corridor. And the model inputs we'll use to model this scenario will be using on the one side the costs, so the annual capital costs of taking on this project, and the annual operation and maintenance costs of maintaining this new transportation route. And then on the other side, we'll be looking at benefits including travel time savings, commuting cost savings, accident reduction, and emissions cost reductions to get a more holistic picture of what's going on from a macroeconomic perspective and a DEI perspective with this project. So I will briefly change my screen over to the model so that we can actually see TranSight in action, TranSight DEI in action. Here we have the landing page for REMI TranSight DEI. And you can see that this is a DC, Virginia, Maryland, and West Virginia metropolitan area 6-region model. We are using a 70-sector model as well, so that describes the level of industry sector detail that we'll be able to go into here. But this is the landing page, the sort of intuitive interface from which you can model different policies and projects in the REMI model. So going over to our particular demo of this Montgomery County project, we'll start with the capital costs, which we've input into the model as detailed industry sales, and specific detail looking at transportation structures and highways and streets. And we've input these increases in spending there so that we see the cost of the project represented across these 3 years of interest. Then O&M costs we've captured here beginning after construction ends, so beginning of 2024 and going to 2030, which will be the end of our time horizon that we'll be looking at today. So this captures the building and the maintenance of this transportation project. Whereas our benefits here under the travel demand group, we can see our travel demand emissions. We have these inputs across the years after construction is complete. So we see a reduction in emissions costs. We see increased leisure time, so increased time cost savings. We see an increase in safety, and we see some decrease here in the effective distance from travel demand. So these are our inputs, and we will go ahead and take a look at the results yielded by these inputs. Excuse me for the lag. All right, here we have our first economic summary table. So this shows us really the overview of the greater macroeconomic picture that we're seeing as a result of this policy change. So looking specifically at Montgomery County, we can see the gain in thousands of jobs across our years of interest. We can see changes in private non-farm employment, changes in residence adjusted employment, the increase in population, the increase in the labor force, increase in GDP, as well as input and output, sorry, not input, increase in output, increase in personal income, etc. So from here, we can take a little bit more of an in-depth look at what's going on beyond just this economic summary table. So getting into our DEI indicators, we will begin by looking at compensation rate inequality. Here we see a percent change in how inequality in the region has, in this case, decreased as a result of our transportation project. So in Montgomery County, we see over our time horizon a decrease in inequality. And I know that you really have to enunciate in inequality. So in other words, an increase in equality over our time horizon. Next, we can look at the compensation rate by industry as another part of our suite of DEI indicators. So here we can really look at how the compensation rate by industry is affecting different income quintiles differently. So we see in the beginning, the second 20% of the income distribution is seeing the largest gains in compensation rate. Whereas towards, after construction ends, we still see gains for the lowest 20%, for the second 20%, but we see some more marked increases for the lowest 20%, as well as some decreases for the higher income groups. This would be, to be expected, I think, for a project like this along, this BRT project along the border in Montgomery County, that's specifically trying to increase access for lower income workers to job opportunities. Looking at employment by industry, this also captures some of those differences across income quintiles. So again, we see our second lowest 20% benefiting over these first 3 years by the greatest amount. And then we see the lowest 20% beginning to benefit over the final 6 years of our time horizon. And we see benefits across the board, just at a smaller magnitude. We can see compensation by industry. This closely mirrors the employment by industry graph, but in this case captures compensation. So again, we see those marked increases for the second lowest 20%, as well as the lowest 20%. Moving on to employment by demographics. This is where we can get a good look at how this policy, or this project in this case, is differentially impacting different racial and ethnic groups. So perhaps most dramatically, we can see that the Hispanic population is benefiting, it's benefiting the most out of all 4 of our groups here. We also see, sorry, skipping for that. We also see those increases. We see those increases for Black non-Hispanic groups and white non-Hispanic groups, as well as Hispanic groups. Excuse me for messing up that formatting. Let me move this over and we can look at that for yeah, so back to this graph, we can see the Hispanic group really seeing that gain in employment, as well as other non-Hispanic and Black non-Hispanic and white non-Hispanic, but the greatest increase here is for the Hispanic group. Looking by gender, we can see that the greatest gains in employment are for male populations rather than female populations, although there are increases in both of those groups. So the next thing that we can take a look at, employment by educational attainment. This is another DEI indicator that can help illustrate the type of jobs being created by this project, and the type of employment, the level of educational attainment needed for employment in these jobs. So at the end of our time horizon, we see that there's been an increase of around 476,552 jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree, and an increase in 281,610 jobs that do require a bachelor's degree and above. So we're seeing here that, this transportation project is not just benefiting, those with higher levels of education, white collar workers, et cetera. It's also bringing in these people without a bachelor's degree into the benefits of this project. Looking at labor force participation rate, we can see, again, across our 4 racial and ethnic groups, the increase in labor force participation. Initially, the results are not too dramatic in the beginning during construction, but after construction, once the route's being used, that's where we see the labor force participation really ramping up. And we even see, as it gets more and more dramatic increases, especially for the Hispanic population and the other non-Hispanic population, we can think about how adding this transportation route basically created an additional amenity to living in the area. So it increased the appeal of living there, and probably attracted a good number of economic migrants to the region, which is why we see those, greater and greater increases in labor force participation rate. Similarly, when we look at the breakdown by gender, we can see women coming into the labor force at a higher rate. And again, this ramping up of labor force participation can be described thinking in terms of that amenity that's really bringing in the economic migrants to the region. So we've talked about employment, labor force participation rate, but now we can take a look at the unemployment rate. So in Montgomery County, we see this drop in the unemployment rate over all of our years of interest. So another good result from this project. And with that, we've gone through some of the key DEI indicators that really showed some interesting results for this particular project. But to show what we can see, specifically in TranSight, when we're thinking about the effect of this transportation route on labor access, this table here will show us the increases in the labor access index across all industries in our region of interest, which is, of course, in this case, Montgomery County. So over time, we see an increase in this labor access index, which is essentially a measure of labor's access to employment as well as employers' access to labor. So with that more accessible transportation, we're getting, we're seeing across all industries this increase in the labor access index. And from there, I will take us back to our presentation to talk more about the results that we saw. All right. So we saw some decreases in the compensation rate inequality for Montgomery County. We saw increases in employment and compensation rates by industry for the lowest and second lowest income quintiles. The most important takeaway, I think, from that employment by demographics chart was those increases for the Hispanic population. And the increases in labor force participation, especially for Hispanic, white non-Hispanic, and other non-Hispanic groups from the racial and ethnic chart. And then we also saw increases in labor force participation for women. And so the explanation there for that increase, that went up until the end of our time horizon, is that an added bus route increased the appeal of moving to the region and attracted more economic migrants. We also saw a reduction in unemployment for Montgomery County, so another good result. And we saw an increase in the labor access index, which showed us that with the more affordable and more accessible transportation option, there were increases in access of labor to employers and employment to labor, and that was reflected in those increases across all of our sectors of interest. Just to go back so that we can remember the demographic makeup of this particular quarter, this can kind of help explain some of, we can see how this diverse suburban area, how it was already 65% minority, 32% foreign born, 30% lower income, and don't have vehicles available, that this population really in those results, we saw that the benefits were going to them, as was intended by this type of policy scenario. So just to talk about TranSight DEI itself, the software we were just using, this is a practical software solution that can account for DEI issues in a transportation context. So we're not just talking about, how many jobs does a project create, what's the increase in GDP, et cetera. We're talking about that, but we can also talk more in detail about, what communities, what racial, ethnic, and gender groups are being brought up or benefiting from the results of this type of a project. We can also see, the different impacts across income distribution to really understand how this this project was affecting the people living in that area, and of course across the county as a whole. Our transportation clients include Michigan Department of Transportation. I won't list all of these out, but multiple departments of transportation, MPOs across the country, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Great Lakes District, et cetera, a number of associations of governments. So these clients all use TranSight to really understand those complex impacts of transportation projects and policies. Another reason that TranSight DEI is a practical software solution for answering these types of DEI questions is that it's an authoritative model using standardized metrics to evaluate public policies. And it's academic, peer-reviewed, and our equations are publicly available. So we take pride in not being a black box. For perspective on the breadth of applications for TranSight DEI, we've been used across the country for these transportation projects in the past. So we've worked in California, Arizona, Louisiana, Illinois, Michigan, New York, just to name a few on these various types of transportation impact analyses. So, whether it be employment and demographic analysis, environmental and economic impact analysis, economic vitality, transportation planning, these are all areas for which you can really use REMI TranSight and can see and help plan effectively to make the best decisions possible for your region. So to close this presentation, I'd like to just drive home why economic modeling matters in a transportation context. So when we're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we don't want to be making guesses or missing the mark. So it's important to inform policy with standard metrics rather than ideology or intention, so that we understand what projects and policies are actually doing and who they're affecting. Of course, there are these DEI reporting requirements at the federal, state, and local levels, and TranSight DEI can quickly and simply prepare these numbers, for those reporting requirements. So to add kind of a layer of ease and facility to those reportings or those reports, that's where TranSight DEI can really come in. Modeling can help address stakeholders with evidence, communicating how a policy or a project benefits or disadvantages their communities broadly, so that you can really address those stakeholder concerns effectively. And finally, the importance of understanding economic and demographic implications of policies before implementing them is crucial in ensuring that public policy truly does serve the broad-based interests of the public and not just the select few.